So you were really a town. You had a town life, and you had a more of a rural
farm
setting.
life. That's right.
Can you describe a little bit what your homes were like?
You mean of the people in our homes?
Well, the physical aspects of the home, were they the same as today? Did they have electricity, plumbing?
Yes, this
heating,
house was very much the
electric heating
same
or gas
as
heating?
it was. I would always, of course, our electricity went off at midnight.
Oh.
But we had electricity. But all the electricity went off at midnight. We had a telephone. We had running water and plumbing, and it's not.
Was it a dial telephone?
No, it wasn't. It was a party line. It was a party line with as many as 15 or 18, maybe up to 20. There'd be 1221, 1331, 1441, 5 and 6, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 plain, and 2, 3, and 3, 2. There were all these numbers on the line. And so you'd have to wait to use the phone. And when somebody else's phone rang, if there was anything exciting, you could go and listen in and see what was going on. Dr. Hall's phone was on our line, and it was always very tempting to go and see who was sick and what was going on.
That was not to be nosy. That was just to be was a neighbor,
that's
right?
right.
In case there was a need.
So you knew when the other lines were ringing?
Oh, yes.
Sure,
Oh,
you
yes.
hear those numbers.
It was a different ring for each?
It was a different ring for each one. And you could tell that it was rung by the operator because it was much faster. She was just pressing a button, whereas we had to turn a crank.
Yeah.
And you could tell that if it was a local line or if the operator was trying to get somebody.
I remember our number on the farm was 7F32. And you wait for that 1, 2, 3, then a pause, then 1, 2.
Yeah.
And our neighbors up the road, the Brimmers, theirs was 2, 4. And so you always knew when there was someone was getting a call or calling each other. But these phones ours was a wall-mounted phone.
Yeah, ours was
and
too.
Had a crank on the side,
Yeah.
and the mouthpiece came out about 10 inches from the wall. You could raise it up or down, and there was a little writing area where you could lay a pad and write on the phone. You probably still see these in an antique shop.
Yeah, we had one hanging in our house, not functioning, but big, bulky wooden things.
Yeah.
Big and bulky.
Ours was right up there on the landing, so that you could hear it. We just had one phone, but you could hear it from upstairs or downstairs, and you also could hear all over the house anything that was said. You never could have a private conversation.
What about cooking? Did you cook on wood or on gas or on electric?
We burned coal.
Coal?
And in the winter, we had a coal fire. And we had a range, a big kitchen range. And in the winter, we used a coal fire. In the summer, we had a kerosene stove that our meals were cooked on. It was too hot to burn coal fire all summer.
Yeah. Did you do the same?
Well, we had a little different lifestyle. Of course, we had a 150-acre farm which had a woodlot. So one of the big jobs in the wintertime was getting wood out and throwing it down when the snow was on the ground, getting it down the fields where it could be cut up and then split and put in the woodshed. So we had a kitchen range which burned wood in the summer, and we burned coal in it in the wintertime. The water was heated in the reservoir at the end of the stove. And we had running water on the farm that came in one room, our pantry. And it didn't come in through the cellar, it just came down to the house, and then out of the ground it came from a reservoir up above the house. It was our own supply. And we lived with that one faucet where you went for water for whatever your needs were. And when I was born, we had no indoor bathroom. That was a call for a little trip outside. Ours was an old farmhouse with the low ceilings. And we had, I remember when spring would come and the weather started to get nice, then we moved from the main kitchen out into our summer kitchen. And most farmers did that. They wouldn't have to heat up the house And so you eat and live out in the summer kitchen a lot in the summer.
Was that a separate building?
A separate room. It was an
Separate room.
Adjoining. It was sort of an addition on the end of the main house. And, my grandmother lived in the basement apartment of the farmhouse, and we lived on the main floor. And we always had a hired man living with us, and we had an attic room where the hired man slept. And the stovepipe used to go from the wood range or the coal range up through his room and heated it. Stovepipe. And that's the way you'd wake him up in the morning. You just take the poker and rap on the stovepipe, and that was his wake-up call.
So you would have to go to this one tap in the pantry for like brushing teeth or washing or...
Right, and fill the reservoir from it, and, we did not have electricity until, for quite a few years. And then my father was told about a gas light that could be had by installing a big tank outside. And this used to be a 500-gallon tank that burned a gas that was made with acetylene. So the tank had water in it, and then you'd buy 200 pounds of Union Carbide, I remember, and put in the hopper, and that would supply gas. And we had pipes run around the house, and we had gas lights. And then later, of course, the electricity came.
Did your electricity come in with the rural electrification?
I believe it did,
Okay.
yes.
It did at the farm.
Yeah.
They never had electricity at the farm in North Petersburg until after Paul's father died. It was put in 1934.
Wow, that was...
So,
Probably about that period.
from a housekeeping point of view, those kerosene lamps were quite a project. They had to be washed every day and filled, and that was just part of your routine.
And that's where I remember doing my homework, sitting at the kitchen table with a kerosene lamp in the middle. And one major activity on the farm in the wintertime, you'd harvest. My father raised many barrels of potatoes and also a lot of beans. And the beans had to be looked over. And I can remember him bringing in a big basket full of beans, and you put the lamp in the middle of the table, and then you pour the beans on the table, and you all sit around, the entire family, and you sort the beans and get the good ones in one pile. And this was great excitement.
Was it something enjoyable that you were sharing as a family, or was it kind of a, oh no, we have to sit here sorting these beans?
No, I think we enjoyed the family more than it was a together kind of a project. And no matter what we did on the farm, we all had to sort of work together on it, and it brought us closer, I feel. And some of the families today are missing some of that.
Everybody kind of goes off in a different direction,
Yeah.
doing different things. Yeah. Well, you're saying you didn't have electricity answers some of the questions I was going to ask about appliances. Like, did you have a radio or a television or vacuum cleaner?
Battery-operated radio.
Mm-hmm.
I think the first radio we had was maybe a Philco or a Matwater Kent or some make like that. The first radio was a crystal set, where you sit with the earphones and you move a sliding control along until you could pick up a station. It was I don't know how it worked, but it was sort of a genius, and you could hear through your earphones, through your headset, and there were several connections where 4 or 5 people could sit around and listen. And then they came out with the loudspeakers, and that was a real treat, because then you could, everyone in the room could hear and enjoy it.
What about television?
Oh, that was unheard of. I don't think television came along until...
Well, the first television set we had, Paul gave me when Edward was born, which was 1954. 53, Edward was born 53.
See, I was born in 1918, so that was many years before television came on the scene.
Yeah. I remember, I think, the first televisions. My father got a make-it-yourself kit when they were first coming out, and I was born in 47, so... What about cars? Did you have any cars, or how did you get around?
My father had a car. There weren't very many people in Petersburg who had cars, and I don't remember the car. I don't, in fact, remember my father. He died when I was 4 years old.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
And then Mama sold the car. She didn't keep it. It was a Chalmers. Nobody ever heard of a Chalmers now, but that was the car. And we had 2 horses. We had a riding horse, a saddle horse, and a carriage horse. But they were all sold when my father died. And so we just got around on our feet and on the bus or the train. The train really provided a lot of transportation for everybody.
Well, we had horses too, of course, and we used to drive them daily. They'd come down with milk, and this is when I was real young. Our first car was a Model T Ford, and that was a real treat. And I think our second one was a Durant. Remember the Durant car? 4-cylinder car. They didn't have antifreeze in those days to keep your radiator from freezing, so when you come home from driving in the wintertime, you had to draw the water out of the radiator. And that meant when you wanted to go somewhere, you had to go out in the cold weather and pour hot water in this radiator to get the engine warm enough to start. And there were no starters on the car, self-starters, so you had to crank them. And they didn't seem to have any oil that was thin for winter. Back then, it was just the same oil that you use in the summer, and you go to crank the car and you could barely turn it over. And sometimes we had to get the horses and hook on the car and pull it on the level to start it. And I still have that memory of my father putting a horse on the front of the car to pull it to get it going.
It seems like it's more trouble than it's worth.
Well, that was one of the jokes of the time. Somebody would be going along in a horse and carriage, and they'd see an automobile broken down, and then they'd yell, "Get a horse! Get a horse!"
Well, we were lucky to have a horse to pull it.
That's right.
Sure.
You mentioned some of the chores that you did at home were like sorting the beans and getting the wood. Were there other things that you were responsible for?
There were only 1 or 2 activities. Of course, the rest of the time was constantly taking care of animals and taking care of horses and cows. And in the summertime, when the cows were put in the pasture, they had to be rounded up and brought in at milking time, morning and night, which meant getting up very early in the morning and going up in the pasture and finding them. And on a foggy morning, that might be more of a project to make sure you got them all.
How many did you have?
Oh, we usually milked around 20, 15 to 20. And the milk had to be cooled and brought down to the village, where it was picked up by a truck that took it to the creamery. But horses had to be watered, horses had to be fed, cows had to be fed and cared for, and the stables had to be cleaned. And we also raised sheep, and we always had 60 or 70 sheep, and they were kept in a separate building up quite a distance from the house. We had to go up there twice a day to make sure they had water and hay, and so these were jobs that boys could help with, so I became involved in a lot of that work.
Did you tend the lambs?
Tended the lambs, although my father was needed there because we had many sheep that had twin lambs. And if a sheep by herself, when she delivered the lambs, if she had one in one part of the barn and then strayed over in another corner, then she wouldn't own the first one. So my father would spend the night up there sometimes making sure that the 2 little lambs were adopted by the mothers. And, it was... those were hard years. We had a lot of hard work.
It sounds like hard physical work.
Hard physical work. So those are some of the chores, and of course, when you have nothing else to do, you can always bring in wood. Fill the wood box and take the ashes out and feed the chickens. There was always something. You were never bored, never idle.
What about down in town? Did you have chores around the house?
Well, I tell you, I didn't have a great deal to do around the house because I lived in a household of women. There was my mother and my grandmother and my aunt and my sister and all the women's work. And I did do one thing, and I told this to somebody when I was interviewed before, the one who wrote the article in the paper, but she didn't put it in. And I think she thought that it was weird. But when the farmers would go by with their horses, sometimes they'd go to the bathroom out in front of the house. And it was my job, and I had a little pail and a shovel. And I had to go out and bring that around to the back of the house where it was used in the garden and in the plants. And I thought that was quite a good story. She wanted to know if I minded it, and I never minded it. It was something it was just part of what I did. And many years later, well, just a few years ago, I don't know if you know, you would know Mrs. Rice in North Petersburgh.
Yes.
Mrs. Rice had a beautiful garden, great big garden. And she was a country woman from way back. She was. She was a lovely person, and I adored her. But she had country people's ways, and she wished she could have a dead woodchuck. Oh, if she could only have a dead woodchuck. It would keep the varmints out of her garden. Something was eating her garden. And she knew if she had a dead woodchuck and could put it on her fence, that her garden would be saved. So I was driving along the road one day, and there was a nice, fresh, dead woodchuck. And I thought, suppose somebody sees me picking up this. But I couldn't. I knew she wanted it so badly. And I guess it was my childhood training of cleaning that up, because I just stopped my car and I put my groceries, took my groceries out of the bag and got out and put the dead woodchuck in and took it to her. And now I can't tell you the punchline because I don't know if it worked or not. She never told me. She just was so thankful to get it, and I'd see it on her fence where she wanted to put it. So cleaning the road was one of my projects.
The dead woodchuck reminds me of our problems with crows in our cornfields. When you plant corn in large fields, the crows would always come and pull out the little plants. So the solution was to shoot some crows and stick poles in the ground and hang the crow on the poles so that the other crows would see it and stay away. And I remember doing that. So that sort of goes along with your woodchuck story.
Yes, that's the way country people
You weren't squeamish.
You grew up to accept those things as this is what people do.
Yeah.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I had an older sister. My brother died when I was 10. That was Henry's father. You knew Henry. His father died when I was 10 years old. He was 26. And, of course, that was an awful, awful blow to our family. And I had a sister who was 11 years older than I. She was somebody that I always looked up to and thought she was always so smart and knew so much. But it wasn't a sister that I could play with or like.
It's 11 years difference.
Yeah, it was 11 years difference.
I was an only child, so I had no brothers or sisters. But I did have neighbors about a half mile away, 2 girls. And occasionally they'd come over to my house and we would play while their mothers visited. And I'd go visiting other neighbors. But I was alone a lot growing up. And that meant that I had to think of things to do to amuse myself. So I learned to manage my own time, find things that I can do by myself.
What kinds of things did you come up with?
Well, of course, I went fishing, and I would go up in the woods hunting when I was old enough. And prior to that, I did all kinds of boyish things like riding a scooter and a bicycle, which I had. And I remember I built a we had rock ledges near our house, and I remember chiseling out a fireplace there and putting a smokestack on it, and just enjoying myself, just burning papers and watching the smoke come out of the smokestack, and just things that you wouldn't think to do. And then we had pets. We had dogs and cats.
Well, now you've always been interested in music, did you?
And I always liked music, and I did take piano lessons for a short time, and didn't like to practice, so I didn't go as far as I would have gone had I worked at it harder. But I remember when I was perhaps 8 or 10 that they had a contest in the Troy Record, the Troy paper. And they had a picture of a jar of beans, and you were supposed to guess how many beans there were in the jar. And
your experience with cleaning beans, kind of.
And I sent in my guess, and I won a prize, which was put out by the Cluett Music Company in Troy, and it gave us some money toward a piano, so we were able to get a player piano. And I remember when we got that, that was a big deal, playing it, and of course later I took lessons on it.
Was that the kind that had the rolls?
It had the rolls, yes, and very, very heavy. It took just about every man you could find to move it, you know, and but it was, to us, it was quite an addition to the home. We enjoyed it.
I think so. What about you, Victoria? What kind of
Well, of course, I had a lot of children to play with. There were a lot of children down at the Wellses. I used to play down there, and Marjorie Simon and I were great friends. She lived over where Mrs. Alston lives, and we used to ride downhill in the winter. We used to play in the pines over on the other side of the Dayfoot in the summer, and we'd go to the movies. On Saturday nights, there were movies at the Eagle Opera House. And not every Saturday night, but probably once or twice a month, I think they'd have movies. And we'd go, and then we'd act out the movies over in the pines. We'd have sticks that were our horses, and we'd ride our horses around the pines and hang from branches and do all kinds of things that we'd seen them do in the movies. And, of course, we always had lots of picnics. We were always packing a lunch and taking it over on the island, or taking it down. Stella Wells would put a blanket out on the lawn, and all the kids would get down and take our lunches and get down there and have picnics. We had a lot. And, of course, it was the river. The river was a constant source of amusement.
Did you play with dolls and trucks and the kinds of things?
I played with dolls. I never was interested in trucks.
I remember I had a toy truck, and I also had a little steam shovel that worked by cranking it, and I remember playing with that. But Victoria mentioned riding downhill in the wintertime. Of course, one thing we don't seem to have much anymore, and that's snow crust. And we used to have fields that would be crusted over. They would be just like glass. And I can remember riding great distances up there on the farm on a sled on snow crust. And I had a pair of skis that just had straps on them. You stick your feet in put your toes under the straps, and then try to go down the hill. And usually I didn't make it all the way to the bottom without falling. But another thing that we had back then that I don't see today, and that's a jumper. And a jumper is a single runner with a vertical piece of wood that holds a seat that you sit on. And you sit on this, and you can balance yourself when you get going, and you can pick your feet up, and you can really go.
Oh, wow.
And I still have one over in the barn that I brought down from the farm, and they were a lot of fun. But I don't see them around anymore.
No, I don't either. The children, we used to have jumpers. I never had one, but the boys had jumpers, and they used to ride on the bank out there with jumpers. Nowadays, the children seem to ride in cardboard boxes.
Yeah.
And they leave them.
More plastic sleds,
Yes.
which we never saw.
But we had sleds, and of course another thing about it is the automobiles. With the automobiles, they plowed the roads, so that wasn't done when I was a little girl, and we could ride on sleds. They weren't plowed; they were just beaten down by the horses and the cutters, the runners, and so the roads would be slippery, very slippery, and we could go long distances on a sled.
Sleighing started early in the winter and lasted all winter, right up to the end of March. Maybe you could drive the sleighs and the things with the horses and not be on bare ground.
And I guess not have to worry about the traffic.
You didn't have to worry about it.
There's one memory I have of the winter, and I have told Earl, he's heard me tell this story before, but I can remember in the morning, or maybe it would be afternoon, it would depend on the severity of the storm. We'd see the farmers come out of Hill Hollow, and they would come out just in the order that they lived. And they were as triumphant when they went through. I don't think Caesar's legions marching into Rome were any more triumphant than the Hill Hollow farmers were. And of course it was a stirring sight. The sleigh bells were ringing, and they'd have their milk cans where they were bringing the milk in, and they'd gotten through all on their own power. I'm sure that Walter Hewitt had to shovel till he got to John Moon's, and John Moon was shoveling on down to Jack Brimmer shoveled Walter Hewitt's, and that's when Earl saw it from the other angle. Yeah, Earl saw it from up there where they were, but I saw them when they drive to the village. And Mrs. John Hewitt was a very handsome woman and a very well-dressed woman, and she didn't look like the country women at all. She was dressed right up. She could have gone to shopping on Fifth Avenue with the clothes that she had, and there she'd sit there on this sled. And there would be her husband and the milk can, and Georgia would have on maybe a fur hat, but a hat and a scarf and her gloves, and she was a picture.
I remember that during those storms there were many, many times when you couldn't drive to the village in the road because the roads would drift so full. They didn't have anything to open them up except to get the men in the hollow together like on a Saturday and everybody shovel out one of these places where the snow would drift. So we had to come to the village through fields and make a new road and drive around the sections of the road that were impassable. That happened a lot of times.
But we'd always call when we'd hear them coming. We'd always call, "Oh, they've gotten out of Hill Hollow. Come look!" And we'd all dash to the windows.
Saw the triumphal.
Yes.
As kids, did you have spending money? Did you have anything that you could?
Aunt Agnes gave me $1 in pennies once, and it lasted an awful long time. I never had an allowance or anything until I went to high school. When I went to high school, then I had an allowance and had to learn to ration my money. You had to spend so much for your train fare and so much for your board and so much for your music lesson and so on. But until then, if I wanted any money, I asked for it, I guess. I know I never had an allowance until...
Same with me. I never had an allowance. I just let a need be known, and my dad would give me money that I needed.
Was there stuff?
$1 was a lot of money in those days. Mm-hmm. You could buy a lot of things with $1.
Were there stores around with things? Did they have toys or candy or things that kids
They had everything.
Oh, yes.
They had everything.
Do you remember anything that you longed for particularly as a kid?
Oh, I remember the thrill of new sneakers and coming down and at the end of the morning chores down in the village, my dad would always go in and buy 2 ice cream cones, and they were 5 cents a piece. Mm-hmm. I remember that. But I remember candy, and I remember the way they kept they had a glass case where they kept their cookies, and you could walk along and pick out the candy you wanted, and we didn't have self-service
No.
then the way you do now. You just went to the counter, and there were a couple of people behind the counter who would go and get what you wanted, so they did all the running, and you just stood there with your list.
That's different.
And they didn't have cash registers for a long time. They would just figure up what you owed on a piece of wrapping paper.
And everything wasn't all packaged. As she says, the cookies were in a glass box,
Yeah.
and they'd reach in and weigh them out. And cheese, or your round
Wheel.
of cheese, was in a glass case, and usually the storekeepers would give you a taste of it to see if it was cheese that you liked. And men in the evening would sit around the stove at the store and cut themselves off pieces of cheese and reach in the Cracker Barrel and get a cracker. But they also sold shoes and farm implements, and everything was sold at the store. You could get just about anything you would want. You rarely went to the city.
Did kids spend a lot of time kind of window shopping in the store? Did they go in and look around, or was that not a major
activity? There was
activity?
too much of that, no. I don't. You went in the store if you needed something, except for the older men, and they'd come in the evening, and this was a place where they'd sit around the stove and visit and tell stories, and as Victoria says, eat cheese and crackers and play jokes on each other. I know that it was quite a social event.
Were there any, you know how these days there are fads in toys, like the Nintendos or the Ninja Turtles, or certain things that lots of kids want? Were there any kinds of fads when you were growing up?
I remember in school, we'd go through a season of playing marbles, and we had those little clay marbles. You don't see them much anymore now. They're mostly glass.
Yeah.
But these were the marbles, and we used to shoot marbles at recess, and go home with a bag of marbles you had won in the game. And something you don't see much anymore, and that's bean bags. And getting back to beans, and I remember we used to play with those a lot as children. Pitch and catch, and they're kind of fun for kids.
We played games too.
Yeah.
We played Flinch. It was a card game that we played, and there were other card games that we played.
Pitch.
Pit, and up at the farm. I never played it here in the village, but it's an old game that they played a lot. It was crokinole. Did you ever have?
Never heard of it.
It was a board game, played on a board, and it had little pegs and round circles with a hole in it, and you flipped them like this and tried to land them. In the middle was a place in the middle that you tried, but there were all these pegs in the way that would deflect them.
Oh, that sounds like a good game.
That was an old game that was fine. We played dominoes.
You remember Tiddlywinks?
Tiddlywinks and checkers.
And checkers.
And pick up sticks.
Oh, right.
Sticks down, and then you had a little tool, a little hook-like that you tried to pick out your stick without moving any other stick.
And there was jacks.
Yeah, jacks.
And you had a rubber ball, and you had to bounce the ball, pick up the jack. And first you do it just picking one up till they were gone. Then you tried to get two and catch your ball and see who could go the highest without missing. That was a fun game.
And that was a game you could play by yourself.
You could.
You didn't have to have anybody to play with you. You could just play. It was kind of like a solitaire that you could play.
But there was always tag, and there was always hide and seek. And
Yeah,
of course at
and
recess
house.
time,
Play house.
Play house.
Play doctor.
And at recess time, of course, boys would play baseball, and girls too.
Mhm.
And But there were some games that you never hear about anymore. Like, remember we used to play London Bridge?
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
And fox and geese in the wintertime, you'd all make a big round path, and then you'd make diagonal paths across. And I don't remember the rules now, but I remember you could get a group of 12 or 15 of your friends around. They'd stand around the big circle, and then the fox had to catch the goose, and the goose could only run in the paths that had been marked out, you see. Mm-hmm. And when you were caught, you were it, then you became the fox.
Mm-hmm. And hopscotch. I used to play hopscotch.
Yeah. That one's still around.
Yeah.
Skipping rope.
Oh, yeah, jumping rope. That was...
Another thing you don't see children doing these days, and that's rowing a hoop.
Mm-hmm.
And, you needed a stick, and you needed a tire from a wagon wheel. And you get on a level piece of road and just to keep it rolling and run alongside.
And if you didn't have one,
you could keep it.
If you didn't have one, you went up to Ed Clark's, which is where Earle Hewitt lives now, and he'd give you a hoop. He worked on wheels and would have it.
Do you remember either of you getting in trouble with your parents, or having them angry at you, or being punished?
I can remember being whipped, spanked once, right there on that landing, and I was spanked for being rude to my grandmother, and that was one thing that would not be tolerated.
Do you remember what you said that was considered rude?
I don't know. I think it was something that I did. I don't know. But I can remember the spanking very well. That my mother telling me that she was my father's mother and I was always to respect her. I wasn't to be saucy to her.
And I remember being spanked once, and I think that was for sauciness too. Just saying something back to my mother that I shouldn't have said. Apparently I didn't want to do something she'd asked me to do, and I was saucy, and so I was punished for that.
And puzzles. We spent hours working on jigsaw puzzles. And
Yeah.
Where did these things, were they all from the local store? Like the board games and the puzzles?
we had them.
They just appeared?
They just grew.
Well, they'd come for Christmas, so you'd get them for Christmas, or we had them.
I'm just thinking now, now people go to Bennington or to Troy or Albany or Williamstown shopping. Did you do marketing in that way?
My mother went to Troy, I would say probably twice a year, and outfitted the family on those occasions. She would come back in the spring with our summer clothes, and she would come back in the fall with the things that we wear to school. And, well, she'd go Christmas, too. She would go at Christmas time. But that's what the main thing I can remember is her coming in and being so excited with all these packages and to see what she had brought for the family and for me and it was a rare occasion when she went away.
But most of the shopping then was done right here in town.
Mm-hmm.
When you did go to Troy or Hoosick Falls or wherever, and there were no malls.
Oh, no.
And so there was just department stores, and I used to think those were just out of this world,
I liked them a lot better than I do malls.
I know. I do. Freers and Hartigans and
Yes.
those stores, and that carried almost everything, And then Montgomery Ward built their huge store down in the Main, and then my folks used to go there.
Yeah, and we had catalogs from there that we would order by mail from.
Yeah, there was a lot of, I think, catalog shopping then, wasn't there?
And we're getting back to it.
Yes,
More.
That's right. Is there anything more about games or leisure or how you spent spare time, whatever was it that you...
Well, we read a lot, and I know that Christmas time, that was the main thing I would get for Christmas would be books. There was no library here. There were a few books at the school, but you could read them in school. I don't remember ever bringing them home. And
what about birthdays? Did you have birthday parties in the way that they have them here?
Sure. It's a family affair.
Mhm.
Aunts and uncles would come and help you celebrate your birthday.
You wouldn't have, like, all the children from your class the way kids
No,
tend to do.
I never did. No, maybe.
I never did either.
It was more of a family celebration.
Family celebration. I remember that I used to get books for Christmas and my birthday. I remember a series of books. Well, the Hardy Boys were around, I guess, back then.
Probably fewer volumes of them then.
Fewer volumes, and I remember a whole series of Tom Swift books. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
Yeah.
Tom Swift and his airship, and Tom Swift, and it was science fiction back then, but everything that it was just looking forward to the future when people could fly, and an airplane was almost unheard of. I guess I'd mentioned before, when you were in the house, maybe having your dinner, if you heard an airplane, everybody dropped their eating and ran outside to see the plane go by. And I remember one time we were thrilled because we saw a dirigible go over I forget whose it was, but we looked up and here goes this gas-filled balloon, over the house, and that was a real excitement. No idea if they made it over the mountain, but we could see the windows in it. It was quite a thrill.
Did you go trick-or-treating on Halloween?
Oh, yes. We did in the village. You did, I imagine.
Probably less, because
We never called it trick-or-treating. That term we never heard of.
Did you call it anything? Did it have
Well, we would go out for Halloween. We always had to have a costume, which was always a homemade costume, something that we'd cobble up. And we would go to the different houses, and we'd have a thing we called a tic-tac, which we'd put on the window, and it would make an awful noise. And then they'd come out, and they'd give us some cookies or candy or something.
I used to enjoy coming down the morning after Halloween
And seeing what they'd
seeing
done.
what they had done,
Yeah.
because they had a way of moving things around and maybe taking a wagon apart and taking it piece by piece and setting it up on somebody's roof.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, they did
Yeah.
really.
Really?
And toilets, outdoor toilets, they love to move them. You'd find somebody's toilet would be on your yard. They'd work so hard. You couldn't have paid them to work as hard as they would on Halloween.
After I moved to the village, I had some wooden steps to get up our bank. I live on a hill, as you know, and to get up on our lawn, these wooden steps went down from the edge of the lawn to the road. And many Halloweens, those steps would get moved or taken away, and I had to go and bring them back. And I remember one year I was tired of going after it, so I chained them and padlocked them to a nearby tree.
Oh, I guess you did celebrate Halloween.
Yeah, it was exciting, as Earl said. The morning after Halloween, look out and see what had landed on Jones's store roof.
I don't remember many fireworks in town. Do you? Back in the early days, I remember coming down with my father once to the store, and it was the day before the 4th, and one of the Reynolds boys was there in the store that lived on the way to Troy, and he had a bag full of firecrackers. That's the first firecracker I'd ever seen. And he was lighting them and throwing them out in the street, and I thought that was a big deal. So I remember he gave me 5 or 6, and I felt rich. And I went home and lit those firecrackers, and it was the first I'd ever seen them. I was probably 8 or 10 years old.